Hi, I'm Jen from Tea Leaves and Tweed, and welcome to Isolation Baking. This week I'm making another loaf of bread, and this is in response to a question I got on my brioche video. One of my friends asked me if the brioche was a good bread for beginners, and the answer to that is a resounding no. Brioche is considered a pretty difficult bread to make. You have to kind of emulsify the butter in, and it's an enriched bread, and that can affect rising. So I thought today I would make my favorite easy loaf of bread. So I'm making no-knead bread. This is based on a recipe that was originally from Jim Leahy, which I'll link below, but I'm doing it in my own little method that I use and just kind of showing you how I make a loaf of no-knead bread. So let's bake. So no-knead bread is just about the easiest bread you can make. It's got 4 ingredients: flour, water, yeast, and salt. Now I am using white whole wheat flour just because that is what I like to use. It's fantastic with regular white flour. If you have bread flour, that's great. So I'm gonna do 3 cups of white whole wheat flour, or bread flour, or regular white flour. If you're really new to bread baking, you probably want to start with white flour or bread flour. I've made this recipe dozens of times before with this white whole wheat flour, so I know it works really well. I would definitely wait before I started adding any fancy flours. I will sometimes make this bread with some rye flour, but it definitely affects the texture, and the first time you make it, you want it to turn out well. So try it with white flour first. If you have regular old all-purpose flour, that is the first thing I made this bread with, and it works great. So then all you need is a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast, which is less than a packet, which is why I go ahead and buy the jar of yeast. If all you have is packets, take a 1/4 teaspoon out of the packet, fold it down, stick it in the fridge, save the rest for another batch. And it's great because it conserves yeast. If you're not a sourdough fan, it doesn't have that sour flavor, but it still uses much less yeast than a typical bread recipe. So if you're stuck at home and you have 1 packet of yeast, you can get multiple loaves of bread out of it. And then I'm just adding kind of a rounded teaspoon of salt. I believe the original recipe calls for something like 1.25 teaspoons of salt. I'm gonna give that a little mix to distribute everything. And then you just add 1.5 cups of water. So the formula is the volume of flour, use half the volume of water to flour. So I used 3 cups of flour, I will use 1.5 cups of water. And this is just regular old filtered water that I got out of the fridge, and this is actually room temperature because it's the carafe of water that I keep out for myself. But it's all gonna end up at room temperature anyway, so it doesn't really matter as long as your water is not too hot. And then you just stir it together. And it is supposed to be pretty wet. It's supposed to be a pretty shaggy, gloopy dough. So I'm actually gonna add a little bit more water because sometimes whole wheat flour doesn't quite hydrate. Because it really is supposed to be quite a wet dough. And you just kind of stir it together. You just want to get it mixed all up so that you don't see any dry bits of flour on the bottom of the bowl. So I'm seeing a little bit of dry flour. I'm going to add some water to help get those mixed in. So I maybe added an additional tablespoon or 2 of water in addition to the 1.5 cups that I added originally. So now we have this kind of wet dough, and this just wants to sit out at room temperature to rise and proof for 24 hours. So what I usually do is I make this the morning before I want it, and then the next morning I can wake up and get it shaped into a loaf and let it go for its second proofing. And so what I'm gonna do, normally I would cover this with plastic wrap, but since we don't really use much plastic anymore, I'm gonna use this beeswax wrap. You want it to be covered pretty tightly. So you just wanna make sure that that seals. It's basically like all natural hippie press and seal wrap. So that is all wrapped up. It just sits out on the counter for 24 hours, and I will join you back here to show you how to shape the loaf and bake the bread. So now it has been about 24 hours. Let's take a look at our dough. You can see that it has bubbled up a lot. It's very wet. It's kind of fluid. So the first thing we're gonna do, oh, I can smell the yeast. So I'm just gonna kind of deflate it a bit with the back of a wooden spoon, and then I'm going to stir it around with the handle of a wooden spoon. And this kind of stretches and works the dough a little, kind of similarly to a dough hook. I learned this technique from a YouTube channel called Artisan Bread with Steve, which I'll link below. So we just want to give it that little stretch and knock it down. And then we're going to get it set up for its second proof. And the way you do this for this wet dough is you want to proof it in a container that helps it take the shape that you want it to be. In this case, a round loaf. And of course, I don't have one of those fancy French bread proofing baskets, or banneton as they're called. So I use a kind of largish cereal bowl, which I line with a woven towel. This one just came from Trader Joe's. And then you want to somewhat generously sprinkle the inside with flour so that it releases cleanly. I think traditionally you would use something like rice flour for this step if you were using a banneton, but regular old whatever flour you use to make the bread works for me. And then to handle the dough, you want to actually wet your hands. I have this little bowl of water to keep the dough from sticking. And you just want to kind of pick it up and fold it so that it gets stretched out into a nice smooth ball. Kind of work it around like that. It's pretty sticky. And then plop it down into your shaping bowl. Give it a little extra dust of flour on top to keep it from sticking to the towel. And then you'll just kind of loosely cover it with the edges of the towel and set that aside to proof for another couple hours about, and then we'll get to baking. Okay, so now I'm in the kitchen and our dough has risen up nicely over the last couple hours, so I need to get it in the pan. And the first thing you need to know about baking your no-knead bread is that it's best to do it in a covered Dutch oven or like a Le Creuset type enameled pot if you have one of those. I just have a regular old cast iron Dutch oven that I put in my oven, and then I preheated the whole thing to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. So now I need to get it out of the oven to put the dough in. So now you just take your dough in its little bowl or basket and just plop it into the pan. And it should plop right out if you floured enough. And I did. And then I don't have a razor blade, so I'm just gonna cut some little scores with a pair of scissors because that's the best way to get through the outer crust. And then it goes back in the oven and I bake this covered for 30 minutes. And then you take off the cover and uncover it for about 15 minutes or until it's really nice and brown And I always measure the temperature of my bread, so I make sure that it reads at least 195 degrees Fahrenheit inside before I take it out of the oven. So I'm gonna get this baked, and then I have to cool it completely, which is probably the hardest part about making no-knead bread. And then I'll meet you back here so we can have a piece of bread. So here is our finished loaf of no-knead bread. So I'm just going to cut into it and have a slice. Now I like to cut my bread directly down the middle. You can see it's a bit of a tighter crumb than if you had made it with white flour, but it's still really delicious and it's got the most beautiful spongy texture. The crust is amazing. And then I like this best with just a little bit of really good butter. This is some of the same cultured butter that I used last week to make shortbread. And I like a nice thick smear of butter. It's unsalted butter, so I'm gonna add a little bit of sea salt to it. I like my butter salted. There's nothing like homemade bread. I'm having a bit of the Earl Grey from the Rare Tea Company to go with my bread and butter. What could be more classic than Earl Grey and bread and butter for afternoon tea? So I hope you enjoyed this week's installment of Isolation Baking, and hopefully I've inspired you to make your own loaf of no-knead bread because it's just so easy. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe if you want to see more of what I do, and I hope I see you again sometime. Bye.